It's just loading. Okay, you guys can start. It's live.
Okay, hello everyone. Go ahead, Bernard, please.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, linking the right to education with tax justice for the Global Campaign for Education. It's a pleasure having you all here. My name is Bernard Munoz. I'm the head of policy advocacy and campaigns, working for GCE. So as you know, as a universal human right and as the engine of the entire development agenda, education should be guaranteed to all people in all cases. So while the international human rights law states that governments should take steps to the maximum of their available resources to realize the right to education, the international policy frameworks are more precise around their obligations on education financing. So, for instance, the Incheon Declaration aligned to the Sustainable Development Agenda states that all countries should allocate efficiently at least 4 to 6% of the gross domestic product and 20% of the total public expenditure to education. So despite these clear obligations, according to UNESCO, the total annual financing gap is around $39 billion. So we should stress that the crisis in education financing arises in part from the aggressive tax avoidance by the richest companies that have left public budgets stripped of resources to fund quality public education. So we believe that the private sector should contribute, building an enabling environment, and their main obligation is paying fair taxes where they make profits. So it's well known that 97% of the new financing needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal on education will need to come from domestic resources. So setting a progressive national budgeting, including the continued payment and incentives of teachers and school staff, is very urgent if we want to achieve SDG 4. So national budgeting for education require the 4 central obligations that GCE, together with Action 8 and Education International, has stated, which are increasing the share of the budgets for education, increasing the size of budgets overall, increasing the sensitivity of budgets in order to respond to the most marginalized, and increasing the scrutiny of budgets so governments are accountable to people. So setting the progressive budgeting obviously require tax justice schemes. And this will be a fundamental shift in how the private sector engages with and supports the public sector in education. GCE works with our members and partners to build a political agenda that requires states to be accountable to their obligations to provide an adequate budget for education and how tax justice should contribute to this end. So this webinar is a very appropriate space to share ideas and propose actions in that direction. So we thank all the participants and the audience and hope that these discussions will be fruitful. So now I am pleased to introduce Maria Ron Balcera, who will moderate the session. So thank you so much for your attention and for your participation.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you very much to everyone who is in this session so far. And as I think Bernard mentioned it, we have interpretation below in French and Spanish as well. And I'm going to actually pass it over to Luis Eduardo, who is going to help us moderate this first half. So Luis, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. And thank you, Bernard, for opening the session. So first of all, we are going to hear David Archer, who is going to reflect on the importance of financing for education. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Luis and Maria and Werner. I think we're at a very, very crucial moment in the financing of education. First, because there's a pretty serious crisis. The $39 billion is just the external resource gap. There's also a serious gap in domestic financing of education. And it is a scandal, an outrage that a child in high-income countries, 43 times more money is spent on education of a child in high-income countries compared to a low-income country. That sort of inequality and injustice cannot be allowed to continue. Now, I think we have an incredibly exciting opportunity coming up next month, because we're still just at the end of August now, but on the 19th of September, the first ever Heads of State Summit on Education, convened by the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, with presidents and prime ministers around the world. It has never happened before. We have never had presidents and prime ministers gathered specifically and exclusively to talk about education. And this Transforming Education Summit, it's had 5 different threads feeding into it on equity, on teachers, on lifelong learning, and on digitalization, but perhaps most crucially on financing. And I've been playing a sort of a role as a stakeholder convener for that financing thread. And the final version of the finance paper for that summit, I think, is really quite a bold and radical agenda. It really starts from the recognition, as Werner highlights, that 97% of financing for education comes from domestic sources. So part of what we really need to see is a sort of decolonization of the education financing debate and a stripping away of the disproportionate power of the donor community, which provides 3% of the money, but often has a massive voice over the direction of education reforms. Perhaps most notably, we focus in that paper in calling for action on tax. Probably the most important thing to make a breakthrough on the financing of education, because lots of countries are spending 20% of their national budget on education, but it's simply not enough to provide universal good quality public education, because it's a 20% share of a small pie. So you've got to increase the size of the pie, and increasing tax revenues is key to that. There is, I don't usually quote the IMF, but the IMF did come up with one interesting analysis about how could low-income countries achieve progress in the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals in practice. And they said that most countries could expand their tax to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points. So low-income countries presently spending, having a tax to GDP ratio of 16% on average, could raise to 21%. If that was done, and it can be done according to the IMF in the medium term, that would be enough to double the spending on education and double the spending on health and double the spending on other services in some cases. It's huge, the implications. It's the sort of seismic transformation that we need to be looking at if we're going to make a breakthrough. And of course, if you're going to expand tax to GDP ratios boldly and ambitiously in the coming 5 years, it has to be done through progressive tax reforms that pass the burden onto the wealthiest individuals and companies, because we are facing in many parts of the world a cost of living crisis. You can't add additional burdens onto the people living in poverty. The focus has to be on genuinely redistributive taxation. And there is a lot that countries can do themselves to expand tax revenues. What, however, is also clearly needed is a new and fairer set of global rules about tax, and a fairer way of setting those rules, because at the moment, the OECD, the Club of Rich Nations, sets global tax rules, and that's just simply unfair. So there is now a call for a UN tax convention. That call for a UN tax convention is supported by African Union ministers of finance recently. And there has to be a more democratic, representative, and fair way for setting global tax rules. The summit on transforming education is calling for exactly that, both domestic, bold action domestically on tax and bold action internationally. And that's a sort of model that is followed right the way through. The summit paper on finance also talks about the crucial importance of action on debt, because so many countries are spending more on debt servicing than they are on education. So you have to take action on debt. And that's partly about national governments taking responsibility for better public debt management, but it's also about international action and bolder action for renegotiation and, in many cases, cancellation of debt. But you also need to look at other things. And the paper that is going to this Heads of State Summit talks about the need for action on austerity. The fact that the International Monetary Fund in its dealings with ministries of finance continues to routinely recommend public sector wage bill constraints as a routine policy. When that is done, we know the consequences of that. The most direct consequence is, in fact, on the teacher workforce, because the largest number of people on the public sector pay are teachers. So if you've got a limit on your overall amount that you're allowed to spend, the only way to deliver on that is to not recruit more teachers, even if you've got desperate shortages of teachers, and not to pay teachers more, even if they're desperately underpaid. So we've got to remove those sorts of constraints, and we're putting a lot of pressure on the IMF and on ministries of finance to change the way in which they're looking at the public sector workforce and to genuinely evaluate and remove those sort of external constraints that have blocked progress in recent years. There is also a really urgent need for a change of mindset, because and we talk about the action needed on changing the mindsets, because most ministries of finance treat education spending as pure consumption, like pouring money down the drain. Every year a budget just disappears. It is not treated as investment, and that's because ministers of finance are forced to look at the short to medium term, at the most 3 to 5 years, and in that time frame you don't get a economic or social return dramatically on investment in education. If you take a longer term time frame, 8 to 10 years, education is pretty much the soundest investment you can make for economic growth, for economic development, for all aspects of a development agenda. Investment in education is probably the soundest investment you can make. But at the moment, ministries of finance cannot factor in those long-term returns within their short-term political and economic cycles. That's got to change. That's something which can be changed by pressure being put on the IMF and on ministries of finance. So we're getting to a point where we're talking about a genuinely strategic financing agenda, which focuses not on aid, but on the reality of domestic financing and the need for urgent international action to remove the blocks in the international system that are blocking countries from increasing spending on education, whether that's about debt or austerity or tax policy. There is a role for aid, and one of the final areas of action that we call for is that if national governments are being told that you should spend 20% of your national budget on aid, on education, then aid, at least 20% of aid should also be spent on education, and at least 20% of concessional loans should be earmarked for education. That's the basis of a global compact for the financing of education, and it's the basis for the sort of transformative change that we need to see. But of everything that I've said, I think if there's one central message, it is the crucial importance of making the connection between tax and education. And that's really the focus of this webinar. I hope that we'll make a breakthrough. We're waiting to see what exactly will be in the United Nations Secretary General's final call to action, an outcome document. It's looking good from what I've seen so far, but I think we need to keep the pressure up. We're hoping that the IMF will be forced to come to the table and make some commitments. And we're trying to put pressure on Kristalina Georgieva to turn up at that summit and make commitments. So in 3 weeks from now, we'll have a better sense of the outcome of that summit. But the financing of education is right at the heart of it all. And the link, really embedding that link between tax and education, is crucial. So thanks so much. I'll pass back over to Luis Eduardo.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for putting all these elements in just 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Maria Rombarcera, who will approach the topic of where should the money come from. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you very much to Bernard and David for setting the scene. For some reason I can, okay, please let me know. Can you see my presentation now? Yes, perfect, great. So my name is Maria Rombarcera, and I'm the Tax and Education Alliance Coordinator. And as Luis Eduardo said, I'm going to be hoping to be showing you where the money should be coming from, because we have been talking for a long time of the lack of financing for education. And this lack this underfunding of education, it is very real, it is historic, and it's having some really negative effects everywhere. So even when in 2015, governments committed to delivering equitable, inclusive, and quality education for all as part of the Sustainable Development Goal 4, and to provide the funding for this, what we saw is that even before COVID-19, there was a chronic underfunding, that the average education budget was 17% in low-income countries, which is below the 20% benchmark in Cheon, and this was 3.4% of the gross domestic product, which is, again, like very low in comparison to the 6% that was the recommended benchmark for low-income countries. But within this, there were some huge disparities in terms of education spending, particularly in terms of the percentage of the government and per capita. And you can see this on the table, on the yellow table on the right. Then we also have, as David pointed out, the public sector wage bill caps, and this has resulted in a growing teacher gap, estimated to be 69 million teachers necessary to cover this, and this number has actually increased since the COVID-19 pandemic. What we need is this domestic resource mobilization. The Education Commission identified that 97% of the resource gap should be coming from domestic sources, and only 3% should be coming from aid or loans. However, we have been dedicating 97% of the time in terms of the attention to these aid or loans, and perhaps only 3% to the domestic resource mobilization. And this should really change if we are serious about financing education. Again, as David pointed out, debt servicing has been taking a huge amount of the domestic revenue to pay for this debt, and it has actually been increasing, not only since COVID-19, but also as we have been seeing after the invasion of Ukraine. Then who is paying for education at the moment? What we see is that when there are not enough revenue to pay for education, for public education, this is leading to privatization of education and cost-sharing strategies. This is leading to exclusion, particularly of those who cannot afford education, not only between groups, but also within groups and even within families who have to choose who to send to pay education, even if there are low fees. So again, this is leading to stratification. If things were bad before COVID-19, things have really worsened since. So we have seen that one of the consequences is that 2/3 of low-income countries and lower middle-income countries have cut their education budgets since COVID-19. We saw that government revenues have been falling because of the gross domestic product falling, right? We saw that, perhaps rightly so, health and safety nets have been prioritized, and we have seen increased levels of debt and poverty. And this is the time that we need extra resources to make sure that all those people who left education because of lockdown and started doing other things actually come back, right? So as Werner put it at the beginning, we need to increase the 4 S's of the budget. We need to increase the share of the budget, which is the expenditure on education, that the benchmark is 20%. And as we saw before COVID times, it was 17%, the average in low-income countries. So this needs to increase, but too much attention has been actually put into this proportion of the government budget spent on education. And it is time to think outside this share box, right? We need to be thinking of how to increase the size of the government revenue overall. And for that, we should be looking at some benchmarks, such as 20% of the GDP should be coming from taxes, right? But not for any taxes, not from, for instance, like sales taxes, right? Or VAT that tends to be very regressive. It should be more from progressive tax reform. So taxing more those that make more money. So rich people, multinational corporation, that particularly through direct taxes with thresholds that increase progressively. And also not giving away tax incentives or tax holidays to corporations, right? Also, we should be looking at how to tax wealth and also the technological companies. Now, we also need to increase the sensitivity of the allocation of the education budget, right? And this should be following an equity criteria. Very important, again, is to increase the scrutiny. We need to ensure that the money arrives in practice timely, and it's spent as it should, right? And for that, we really need to increase the capacity of all the people, the constituency and the stakeholders to be able to track the budget. And this is especially true in disadvantaged areas and in local areas. So it's about increasing the forces of the budget. But as I was saying before, we really need to be building the capacity on understanding where the budget comes from, right? And how we can increase the size of the budget. So the tax to GDP in low-income countries has been averaging at 14%, when the recommended is 20%. And many European countries, for instance, reach nearly 40% of the GDP comes from tax revenue, which is the most sustainable way to increase the GDP. But why is this size not bigger? This has to do with illicit financial flows. Just in Africa alone, they cost $88.6 billion every year, right? 40 billion comes from the extractive industries, from the mining industry. Globally, $245 billion are dodged every year by multinational corporations. We published a study a couple of years ago that G20 countries lose $32 billion only from 5 technological corporations. So Alphabet, which is the parent of Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft. So just think how much money we are just losing that should be spent on education and other public services. And this is why we need tax justice. First, because it increases revenue, tax pays for public services, education, health, etc. It increases redistribution, which is the transfer of wealth from rich to poor through pro-poor interventions. It also allows for repricing. And in this case, tax can be used as a tool to encourage or discourage the consumption of specific goods and services, such as discouraging pollution, but encouraging, for instance, education services, etc. Right? It also increases representation because it strengthens the social contract between the citizens and the states with rights and accountability. We pay taxes and we receive public services, right? Or rights as well, right? And rather than just going through loans, which really breaks this accountability. So in a nutshell, tax justice increases sustainability, democratic accountability, governance, transparency, participation, institutional quality, and human rights, among others. So what specific reforms should we be advising our governments to adopt? So the first thing perhaps would be to review, stop signing, and consider canceling double tax agreements or tax treaties, right? This has been done particularly with some really negative countries in this sense in terms of tax treaties, such as Mauritius or the Netherlands. Again, the same thing about reviewing, canceling, or stop giving tax incentives or tax holidays, especially to destructive companies, mining. Another reform would be not to spend more than 12% of the budget on debt repayment services, because we have seen that this really decreases the expenditure on education and other public services. Not to increase VAT or sales taxes, which tends to be a really tempting reform for governments. Not a step public sector which builds constraints, because we see that this is really negative later on for the economy and particularly for education. To increase the forests of education budget, as we have described before, to demand debt cancellation and increase SDR allocation, to support the UN tax body and other FACTI panel recommendations, to adopt and demand a minimum corporation income tax of 25%, to tax wealth and the digital economy, and to demand transparency and accountability and compliance using the ABC of the tax justice. And I can refer you to the website about what this ABC is, because I don't want to take more time. So thank you very much, everyone, and over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for providing this just great picture. So after hearing Bernard, Maria, and David with this kind of global picture, we are going now to hear the reflection from the region. So first of all, I will give the floor to Rene Raya from ASBAE, reflecting about the financing for education in Asia. Over to you, Rene, and thank you for making time for this event.
Thank you, Luis, and good day to everyone. Well, as you may know, the situation of education financing in the Asia Pacific region has stagnated and has actually become more challenging, especially in the last 2 years due to the COVID pandemic, partly, but because it is also beset with systemic issues, systemic problems in financing and in domestic revenue generation. Well, to start with, most of the sub-regions in the Asia Pacific are the least spenders in education if we compare this to much of the developing world. And this is in terms of, the size of the education budget in relation to GDP and in relation to the national budget. And in the last 2 years, actually, because of the contraction of the economy, because of the fall in revenues, because of debt and debt repayments that awaits most governments, most countries in the region, where debt has actually reached historic high levels in many countries across the region, then this add up to the pressure and threaten the continuous and increases in education budget. So what we see in the last 2 years that spending levels has actually stagnated and remained at very low levels between 2 to 4% of GDP, so way below the global benchmark. And this is true for most of the countries. And in fact, there have been decreases in a number of countries in relation to GDP and in relation to the overall government spending in countries such as Samoa, PNG, even Vietnam, and Mongolia to some extent. So these are the new challenges that countries in the Asia Pacific region faces. Now, the sad thing about the region also is that the region generally has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratio. So in terms of generating the much needed resources for public services, education especially, then we are way below the global averages. And in fact, the tax to GDP ratios actually declined by 1 to 2 percentage points in the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020. We're doing only something like 19%, which is below that of Latin America and much of the OECD countries. And so even as we campaign hard about, raising domestic revenue, the trend actually is that there has been a lowering of corporate income taxes in a significant number of countries in the region. So we used to, have an average of about 25 to 30% corporate income taxes, and now it is raised to the bottom, going down to 20 to 22% in a number of countries such as the Philippines, such as India, and many more in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And so these are the issues that we confront in the region that has been exacerbated because of the pandemic. And there's, the prognosis for the next few years is not really bright. And because, there are political issues that we confront as well, countries such as in South Asia, the case of Afghanistan, the case of Myanmar, even the case of the Philippines and India, where you have populist government that are, doing the wrong things in relation to financing and in relation to domestic resource mobilization, showing, really the bad example of how not to pay taxes and how to avoid paying taxes for themselves and for the huge multinational corporations. Now, we see that the campaign has to really take a political shape, meaning doing organizing, doing political work, doing advocacy and mobilizing the stakeholders, the parents, the learners, and the communities themselves. What we see now, because it's a big battle that you have to do when you wage a campaign for illicit funding flows, corporate income taxes, going to the local areas provides an opportunity by which we can raise and earmark certain revenues for education. And that possibility becomes quite clear, and the windows of opportunity may be widening for these countries because of also the localization drive, where more and more authorities and policy making, as well as revenue generation, is being vested or mandated to local governments. And so that is one area that we are looking on, and possibly organizing communities in order to campaign for increasing revenue at the local level that can be earmarked for essential public services, including education and health. And one of the areas that we are looking at would be real property taxes. Real property taxes is really small, and it has not been administered well in most countries and most local areas. But the funds that can be generated from real property taxes that are owned by the wealthy and the rich corporations and individuals can be, a source of important additional funding for public services, education, health, especially. And so that is one area. Another area that we can look at and explore would be on additional levies for tobacco and alcohol, which would have popular support because of the health that is connected to these issues and the need for education, and because it affects and impacts on the youth especially. And youth now is a very important stakeholder in education, and so this is something that we can also look into for opportunities of imposing higher taxes on these sin products, we call it, and part of that can be earmarked or increased revenues in general that can be devoted or earmarked for education as well. So notwithstanding the difficulties that we face, we should be able to look into opportunities, windows of opportunities by which we can campaign. And as I mentioned, one area would be looking into local revenue generation, especially with the decentralization that is going on in many countries across Asia and the Pacific. I'll stop here and thank you. Over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Rene. Thank you for sharing with us this very, very concerning picture. I am sure people will have maybe comments or questions about the situation in Asia. Now, I will give the floor to Mr. Boaz Waruku, who will be sharing the picture now in Africa. Thank you, Boaz, for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thanks to the previous speakers, and particularly Rene has really painted a clear picture of what obtains in this region. I think when coming to Africa, we are not very far from the picture that is being painted. But I have to start right from why do we even talk of linking education to tax justice? I think the obvious answer for us in Africa is that it is the only reliable and sustainable mechanism through which then resources, public resources, can be made available to service the social sector, including education, actually starting with education as a priority. And I intend to take you through some of the issues that really concern us, and as we ponder them, because they are universal across the continent of Africa. This actually is informed, even as ANSEFA, why then we consider it a critical component to talk about in our advocacy, in our campaign work, and our pillar number 2 within the strategic plan of ANSEFA is speaking very, very clearly, succinctly about inclusive and equitable education. And equitable financing of education, that then we can ensure that resources are made available for education as per the SDG 4. And so within that component, even as the work that we do, we are looking at the aspects of how we ensure that there's better financing, that within the better financing, the size is improved, and particularly from the domestic revenue sources. And that is also the component for that to be really achieved. There must be the fair tax practice or the system in place that ensures that indeed we have a better tax regime in the area. And there are components also of the international aid that is normally given to a number of our countries. We're saying that one, as a priority, the aid should really be done and coordinated through credible support of the local stakeholders. And in most cases, our local education groups play a very important role. And then that is where then the civil society, inclusive of the teachers' voices, human rights advocates, really get to champion the cause for appropriate and sustainable or adequate financing. And the aspect that our voices as civil society continue to ensure that the commitments our governments make, particularly on the financing of ensuring that not less than 20% of our annual total budget is actually allocated to education, and not just allocated, but spent, and also spent in an accountable manner. I think within the forest framework, which the previous speakers have ably really talked about. And also in terms of the budgeting aspects, because there are also leakages within the process. The budgeting process, we have advanced the cause for an open budget process with public participation right from the start to the time of implementation and spending the amounts, and even the reviews of how effective those frameworks have been done. So that helps us really to protect the education resources against corruption and illicit financial flows. And so it is important for us then to project the view and the issues that then we are addressing along what we've been witnessing across our continent. Because we know that many of our countries have suffered chronic underfunding. And unless something really radically is done right now, we risk really missing our targets within the SDG 4 and even the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. And so this has got the essence really of violating our commitment to delivering the rights to education for every child, for every girl, for every child with a disability, for every young person in training and all that. And indeed, we are also conscious of the fact that when COVID attacked, the pandemic really made matters worse. And indeed, at the height of the pandemic, I think we can project from the estimates that UNESCO and the agencies did have that about between 393 million and 250 million in the sub-Saharan countries were likely to suffer from at the risk because of the COVID that really came in, and when it attacked the institutions, it attacked the health, it attacked education, and we had those kind of leakages, and indeed then the resources were not made available for the education. We've also had the chances or the challenges where we face constraints in terms of then being able to meet the needs, the critical needs of education, the educators themselves and the learners. And in this case, I think based on a variety of issues, because we know that in most of our countries across the continent, these are the countries where you still find the practices of gender bias practices still really at the core of delivering our education. We are talking about when Corona came and all that, but the pandemic really also hit us hard because the level of technology, just a very basic technology that would help us even to overcome such challenges, are also still very low. And indeed, the fact that the sexual and gender-based violence activities, which made it very difficult even for many of our girls to get back to school. And from the report that UNESCO did document, and of course gathered from the statistics from our countries across the continent, about 11 million of the girls did not report back. And indeed, many of the children with disability also got affected. And so for us, we consider that in order for us to continue supporting the education needs of our countries, particularly ensuring that the public education systems that we have in place are sustainable and are adequately supported, then we are linking how that can only be done through a progressive tax system without the leakages that then have had the effect of reducing the revenue for the government. So we are advancing the case for making progressive tax across the region so that every government, every state agency, because some of our countries have got devolved structures. So every agency within that then concentrate on ensuring that the taxes that are collected are really addressed or directed towards ensuring that we have education for all the young ones. And indeed, I think we also look at it from the aspects of, because we are generating a lot of resources, but a lot of it then is taken away through debt. And so addressing the component of debt is very, very critical. I think it is the UNCTAD report that did indicate that between 2020 and 2021 alone, our countries actually incurred up to almost 1 trillion in external debt repayments. And you see, if all that we are generating again is taken away, then we are left with little funds actually to ensure that education is financed. So we must also link it up with debt issues and debt management. And indeed, I think it is high time that we also talked about the debt cancellation. And we also look at how do we ensure that the resources we generate now through the progressive tax systems are also made then available to first and foremost fund education. We are looking at how we can also free up funds from other sectors and other public services. Indeed, because I know the link has been made, but I think it needs to be made a little bit more between the security of the state and the education. And indeed, because we've seen cases where in areas which have not really been adequately provided for in terms of public education, you realize that the skirmishes, the conflicts that evolved so that it becomes a fragile zones. This happened, and indeed, so then the security of the state then is linked to, to education in such a way that the governments think that by prioritizing security, that they are allocating more resources to cater for security, at the expense of education. I think we should be persuading our governments that that is not the long-term solution to the conflicts that you have in this number of countries, that the long-term solution relies on prioritizing education now and ensuring that the resources already earmarked for education are actually spent in education. Because when we educate those young ones now, the future looks better, because they'll be able to negotiate a round table and not with guns or other arsenals when a conflict does arise. And so I think looking forward, because I had a number of the statistics which we could have looked at, just to share an example of how even the countries that are struggling to generate adequate resources, they lose that through I said that debt servicing. The case of Kenya, like 36% of the GDP that was actually used in servicing debt in 2019. The Nigeria case, where a number of the highest number of children are out of school, because of the tax to the GDP ratio also being extremely low. And we realize that with the kind of expenditures that were expected really to manage, it was very, very difficult for them to address the issue of the out-of-school children, which still stand out really so strongly there. So moving forward, I think for us, we'll be looking at one, just being clear that when we make commitments to meet the global targets of allocating and spending not less than 20% of our budget, we should do exactly that. That's two, expanding our tax revenue and ending the illicit financial flows. This in itself has got a way of helping us really to work towards a minimum of at least the tax to GDP ratio of 20%. And we are also talking about increasing our domestic commitments to education so that then we do not continue thinking that education is one of the areas where you can go and vary the budget. So our advocacy work through the National Education Coalitions continue to ensure that they keep track of those allocations and ensure that they are spent in the right manner. So the reallocation of the budget and all that, we only talk about reallocating to meet equity and inclusion targets, but not necessarily to take it away from the education to other areas. And so we are also then calling on just trying to impose this, the World Bank and the IMF conditionalities, which we are seeing in a number of countries. For example, there are countries in Africa that are literally not recruiting more teachers, yet they have serious gaps. It's just because they have been told using the IMF conditionalities that they are supposed to cut on the wage bill. I think those are the areas that we require really to put a stoppage on. Otherwise, as for us in Africa, I think it is high time that we started looking at how do we extract more resources, process those resources in Africa, generate more revenue for our government, and use those revenues to finance education. We should not be having the tax breaks for companies which give them tax breaks. For example, you'll find there are countries, including Kenya, where
I am so sorry, but the time is over. Please just close your presentation.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
and I was just summing up and saying that that we need to avoid the cases where we are forced to give tax breaks. And because those tax breaks do not benefit education, they do not benefit the ordinary person. In fact, they only benefit those big people who are in big business, and they make millions and millions of dollars out of the resources or the wealth of a country. So we should actually, starting from when they start the investment, we should apply adequate tax measures to ensure that we get those resources and apply them in education. Thank you so much. And sorry for really taking much longer time. I thought I was still within the 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Thank you. You didn't see my message, but yeah, this is absolutely fine. Thank you for sharing all of this. Please all remind that the 5 minutes presentation, and thank you for making that clear, the message. Linking education and that justice is the only reliable way to increase sustainable funding for education. Really appreciate it. Now it's time to give the floor to my colleagues from Latin America. So we are going to have Laura Gianchinetti from CLADE, and then Adrián Falco from the Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y el Caribe. 5 minutes each. Welcome, Laura.
Gracias, Luis. Muchas gracias por la invitación y también a los colegas por las brillantes presentaciones. Bueno, quisiera decir que lastimosamente el escenario del financiamiento de la educación en América Latina y el Caribe se repite, es insuficiente, se presenta de manera similar, aunque con especificidades, claro. Voy a empezar compartiendo un análisis del contexto del financiamiento y luego mi colega Adrián Falco hablará sobre cómo ampliar la base fiscal. Entonces, empiezo diciendo que en el 2014, en el marco de las negociaciones de la Agenda 2030, los estados de nuestra región se comprometieron a asignar un 6% del PIB para la educación y un 20% del presupuesto, del presupuesto nacional para la educación. Entonces es a partir de estos acuerdos regionales que hacemos nuestras campañas y nuestras acciones de incidencia. No se comprometieron del 4 al 6 o del 16 al 20 como está en la agenda. Se comprometieron más ambiciosamente al 6 y al 20. Bueno, según datos de nuestra última actualización del sistema de monitoreo del financiamiento del derecho humano a la educación en nuestra región, que analiza las bases de datos de UNESCO, CEPAL y el Banco Mundial para 20 países de nuestra región, en el 2019, de los 14 países con información disponible, solo 2 habían cumplido con el acuerdo del 6% del PIB. Eran Cuba y Costa Rica. Otros 6 países asignaban cerca del 4% y los demás estaban por debajo de este indicador. Respecto al indicador del gasto en educación como porcentaje del gasto público nacional, la tendencia es un poco más promisoria. Considerando el último dato disponible en cada país, superan la meta del 20%. Chile, Costa Rica, Cuba otra vez, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, y están casi cerca del 20%, Perú, República Dominicana y El Salvador. Pero como las riquezas en la mayoría de estos países es chica, ese indicador tiene límites, estos 2 indicadores tienen límites para decirnos si los recursos son o no suficientes para financiar el derecho humano a la educación, y es por eso que nos gusta mirar adicionalmente en los montos asignados por persona en edad escolar en cada país, es decir, cuánto cada estado invierte en cada sujeto de derecho concretamente. Y en ese caso, si en los últimos 20 años tenemos un elemento importante porque la región duplicó los recursos asignados a la educación, pasando de $1,180 por persona en el trienio 1998-2000 a $2.500 entre 2019 y 2021, estos montos son muy bajos cuando comparados con el promedio de la inversión de los países de menores ingresos de la OCDE. Entonces, en el 2017, los países más pobres de la OCDE asignaban $7.469 por persona, es decir, que 3 veces más que el promedio de nuestra región. Y hay un elemento adicional que es preocupante porque la región, que es conocida como la más desigual del planeta, presenta disparidad muy grande entre los estados. Entonces, mientras Costa Rica invierte $5.376 por persona, o invirtió ese monto en el 2019, Guatemala asignó $669. O sea, 10%, un poco más del 10% que su vecino. Y eso evidentemente trae y se refleja en una mala situación de la infraestructura escolar, bajos salarios, insuficiente disponibilidad de textos y otros insumos para la educación. Bueno, eso era antes de la pandemia. Si estos sistemas ya estaban infrafinanciados y sometidos a la presión desde antes del 2020, seguramente la pandemia agudizó ese escenario. Se estima que en 2020 el PIB de América Latina y el Caribe cayó un 7.7%. Y según la CEPAL, fue la mayor caída en 120 años, lo que produjo también una caída en el nivel de recaudación de impuestos de los estados. Eso produjo, ¿no? La pandemia también produjo una reorientación de los fondos según las emergencias detectadas, o sea, para fortalecer los sistemas de salud, el acceso a los servicios básicos y a programas de protección social, lo que está muy bien, pero la educación no fue priorizada. Además, nuestra región, que ya estaba bastante endeudada, en varios países se firmaron nuevos acuerdos de préstamos, lo que ha puesto bajo riesgo la inversión pública en educación. Los 3 países de mayor deterioro en relación deuda-educación en los últimos 5 años fueron Argentina, Ecuador y Honduras. Y en el 2020 se estima que la región pagó alrededor de 95.000 millones de dólares a servicios de la deuda. En Argentina, Brasil, Jamaica y Santa Lucía, el gasto público en la deuda fue mayor que el monto destinado a la educación. Entonces, es un dato muy preocupante. Bueno, con miras a enfrentar ese contexto de bajo financiamiento para la educación, creemos que es fundamental apostar en 2 estrategias. Primero, identificar qué cantidad de recursos efectivamente es necesaria por sujeto de derecho para garantizar el derecho humano a la educación en distintos contextos. En tal sentido, contamos con una experiencia muy inspiradora de la campaña brasileña que desarrolló el costo alumno-calidad, identificando cuál es el monto necesario para garantizar una calidad mínima de la educación y identificando que en Brasil es necesario invertir al menos el 10% del PIB para la educación, para empezar a hablar de calidad. Eso no es la calidad que queremos aún, pero como mínimo necesitamos un 10%. Por otro lado, es necesario pensar en caminos para ampliar la base fiscal de manera progresiva y, consecuentemente, encontrar los recursos necesarios para la educación, elemento que será explorado por mi colega Adrián Falco. Entonces, lo invito a su presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Gracias, Luis Eduardo. I will speak in Spanish. Bueno, cuando uno reflexiona sobre estos temas y escucha al resto de los compañeros y las compañeras que han participado, uno piensa que está en el mismo país, ¿no? Parecemos todos parte del mismo país porque la problemática es muy similar en todos nuestros países. Faltan recursos, no sabemos de dónde obtenerlos, y los sistemas tributarios de alguna manera se presentan como un buen lugar para ir a buscar ese financiamiento que nos está faltando para la educación. Yo voy a presentar muy brevemente un trabajo que hemos hecho con CLADE, con Latindad y con la Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y el Caribe, y que tiene que ver con un estudio comparado entre Argentina y Guatemala sobre cómo hacemos para que Argentina y Guatemala puedan tener más recursos para la educación a través de algunas mínimas reformas del sistema tributario, a través de un impuesto a las grandes fortunas, a través de la revaluación, digamos, de las propiedades, algo que se dijo aquí anteriormente, y a través de un férreo control, una férrea regulación y fiscalización a las grandes corporaciones. En primer lugar, caracterizar el sistema tributario latinoamericano, pero en el caso de Guatemala y de Argentina es muy paradigmático porque representa casi el espíritu de la región. Obviamente que los impuestos en el caso de Guatemala y de Argentina, la mayor parte son impuestos indirectos, es decir, impuestos al consumo, impuestos que pagamos todos los ciudadanos y ciudadanas, independientemente de nuestra condición socioeconómica. En el caso de Guatemala, el 50%, 51,3% de la recaudación se explica por impuestos indirectos. En el caso de Argentina, el 47%. Y en el caso de Guatemala, el 31% son impuestos directos, es decir, impuestos progresivos a las ganancias, a los patrimonios, a los bienes suntuarios, etc. Y en el caso de Argentina, es solamente el 27,9%. Ahí ya nos da la pauta de sistemas tributarios absolutamente regresivos, y eso es que hay que modificarlos si queremos pensar en que el sistema tributario sirva para apoyar nuestro desarrollo, sirva para apoyar y mejorar los sistemas, los presupuestos educativos. Esa lógica regresiva hay que dar la vuelta para poder tener mayor financiamiento en la educación. Uno de los mitos, mejor dicho, que desmonta este estudio que hemos hecho en América Latina es la famosa ayuda oficial al desarrollo. Muchas organizaciones incluso descansan en esta lógica de, bueno, apostemos a la ayuda oficial al desarrollo, apuntemos nuestros cañones a eso, a mejorar algo que ya está escrito. Bueno, nosotros relevamos desde Argentina y de Guatemala también qué pasaba con esa ayuda oficial al desarrollo y si era posible, a través de ella, lograr mayor financiamiento. En el caso de Guatemala, entre 2010 y 2019, la ayuda oficial al desarrollo pasó de 0,09 del PBI al 0,5. Nada, o prácticamente nada. En el caso de Argentina fue peor, porque disminuyó, pasó del 0,3 al 0,004 en 10 años. Es decir, que disminuyó, en el caso argentino, notablemente la ayuda oficial al desarrollo, lo mismo que en Guatemala. Aumentó, pero muy poquito, casi imperceptible. Es evidente que la ayuda oficial al desarrollo no es un camino posible para aumentar el financiamiento educativo. Entonces nosotros nos propusimos desde CLADE, desde Latindad, desde la Red de Justicia Fiscal, bueno, generar una propuesta. Nosotros proponemos que tomemos 3 diferentes impuestos que ya existen en la región, en ambos países, en Argentina y en Guatemala, y reformulémoslos en función de nuestras necesidades. Como dije, uno es el impuesto a las grandes fortunas, el otro es el impuesto predial, es decir, reformulación del impuesto a las propiedades, pero ojo, no estamos hablando de pequeñas propiedades, estamos hablando de grandes extensiones de campos que generan muchísimos recursos, estamos hablando de grandes propiedades que están subvaluadas, que tienen un valor fiscal irrisorio y sobre eso pagan impuestos y no valor de mercado. Lo que apuntamos es a que tengan valor de mercado y que los impuestos se paguen sobre valor de mercado, no sobre valor fiscal. Y por supuesto poner un freno a los abusos corporativos. No voy a detenerme en la especificidad del trabajo que se ha hecho del cálculo. Digamos, pueden tener acceso a este informe en la página de CLADE, también en la página de la Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y Caribe. Está el informe colgado para que lo puedan descargar. Próximamente va a estar en inglés, por ahora está en español, pero en unos días más va a estar en inglés. Entonces nosotros hicimos un cálculo sobre cuál sería el incremento potencial estimado de la recaudación a partir de la modificación en estos 3 impuestos. Y en el caso de Guatemala, nos dio que Guatemala podía incrementar en un 1% su producto, es decir, el equivalente en la recaudación al 1% del PBI de Guatemala, y en el caso de Argentina al 2% del PBI. ¿Cómo se refleja esto en aumento del presupuesto educativo? Bueno, Guatemala podría haber aumentado el 34% de su presupuesto educativo, echando mano a estos tres impuestos, reformulándolos. Y Argentina un 41%, casi duplicaría, sería la mitad de lo que Argentina invierte en educación. Esto sin ayuda oficial al desarrollo, que es escuálida, es vergonzosa, sin endeudamiento, sin ajustes, sin ajustar a otros sectores, simplemente volviendo más progresivos nuestros sistemas tributarios a través, básicamente, de estos tres impuestos. El impuesto predial, el impuesto a las grandes fortunas y la fiscalización y la regulación de los abusos corporativos. Para que se dé una idea, hay otro tema también que nos gustaría tocar más adelante, que es el tema del gasto tributario. América Latina y el Caribe pierden 5% de su PBI en gasto tributario. Esto es lo que los países dejan de recaudar por entregar exoneraciones fiscales a las grandes corporaciones. 5% del PBI. Es casi la inversión regional en educación. Eso hay que revisarlo urgentemente. Después, sobre las pérdidas que nosotros tenemos como región anualmente. Algunos datos de algunas organizaciones que trabajan en la región. Por elusión fiscal, por ejemplo, dejamos de recaudar 500.000 millones de dólares por año. Por evasión fiscal, 320.000 millones de dólares por año. Como les decía recién, perdemos el 5% de nuestro PBI regional en exoneraciones fiscales. Y el estudio que hemos hecho sobre impuestos a las grandes fortunas, perdemos por no gravar a las grandes riquezas 26.000 millones de dólares por año como región. Hay muchísimo recurso para aumentar el financiamiento educativo de nuestros países. Finalizando, dos cosas. Mientras la OCDE siga regulando la gobernanza a nivel fiscal, a nivel global, no vamos a avanzar en una democratización de las decisiones y de las políticas fiscales globales. Hay que trabajar urgentemente dentro de Naciones Unidas para que todos los países estemos representados, contando nuestras problemáticas y generando propuestas en función de nuestras problemáticas. Eso es por un lado. Y por otro lado, seguir trabajando en la agenda de transparencia fiscal y financiera. Registros públicos de beneficiarios finales, saber quién es dueño de qué y en dónde en cada uno de los países para poder gravar los impuestos de la mejor manera. Reporte de actividades empresarias país por país, saber qué impuestos pagan en cada uno de los países. Fortalecer las administraciones tributarias en su capacidad reguladora, fiscalizadora, sobre los mercados de capitales. Nosotros entendemos que profundizando estas medidas vamos a tener sistemas tributarios robustos que nos van a permitir tener mejor financiamiento, no solo para la educación, sino también para otros sectores que están muy retrasados en nuestra región, el sector de salud, el sector de empleo, el sector de juventudes. De esta manera, y echando mano a esto que planteamos en este estudio, vamos a poder tener una educación de calidad, gratuita, universal, sin ajuste, sin endeudamiento, sin desmerecer otros sectores en beneficio de otros. Esa es la propuesta que nosotros venimos a traer desde la Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y el Caribe y de CLAVE. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, Adrian. Thank you for sharing all of this. Please feel free to share the links to the resources in the chat, because some people are asking that they want to read that. So now I will leave the floor to Kakunta from the Zambian Teachers Union. Over to you, Kakunta. Are you there, Kakunta?
I can see Kakunta, but I think that he is in the attendees. I don't know whether Salma or any other host can make him a panelist.
Oh, just let me check. Salma, can you help me with that?
Yes, I have most of them a few times. Yes, he is on the panel list.
Oh, he is in the panel list already.
There you
Okay,
go.
Kakunta, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, Kakunta, over to you. Please, 5 minutes, share with us the financing for education from the teacher's perspective. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, first of all, good afternoon to everyone that is in this meeting. And it's important for me to quickly mention that education financing, and from the teacher's perspective, is one of the most critical issues that we as teachers representatives from the union side have been pushing as a critical component of giving a guarantee to quality teaching and learning. I know that from the different presentations that have been made, it is very clear that proper and appropriate education financing cannot be overemphasized. Cannot be overemphasized in the sense that if we are talking about providing quality education and education that is accessible for all, we must ensure that the countries, the respective countries, have the right resources that can allow them to be able to finance education, which is going to provide a platform for everyone to be able to have access. Then I know that from the different presentations, it has been made very clear. And from our engagement as members of Education International, it has come out very clearly that majority of the poor countries, it may be in Africa, it may be in Latin America and elsewhere, most poor countries who are finding challenges to finance education rightly are countries who are more dependent on the extractive industry, which also is mostly managed by multinational companies. And in the manner that they come to manage these extractive industries, it clearly shows that they go into a number of negotiations, which at the end of the day have disadvantaged most of these poor countries, which ultimately spills over to the issue of poor financing. Poor financing because of the many agreements that these countries have gone into with these multinational companies, which ultimately, at the end of the day, they have failed to pay the right taxes in the name of poor agreements that they could have entered into by different governments in a number of these poor countries. Now, what or how has this poor education financing affected the teachers in a number of these countries where the tax systems are poor, where there is injustice in the tax systems, which mostly is coming from these big multinational companies? The first thing that I need to quickly indicate is that on a broader perspective, majority of these teaching jobs have become unattractive. What do I mean? What I mean is that majority of people who could have been quality teachers, majority of the teachers in certain areas where we could have gotten quality teachers to teach certain technical subjects like science, mathematics, you find that most of these teachers who are taught or trained in these areas have ended up leaving the education sector because the teaching jobs are not attractive. Not attractive in the sense that most of the countries or poor countries have failed to finance education right, and majority of the good teachers, majority of the people who would be teachers who could have come in the education sector to help provide quality teaching have shunned the teaching jobs because of, first of all, that there's poor financing in a number of countries in the education sector. Apart from that, the next thing that has come as a negative impact because of poor financing of education is that a number of countries, in most poor countries, have failed to supply the right number of teachers in a number of schools, in a number of education systems, hence, or thereby creating a situation where a number of teachers in countries where the financing of education is extremely poor, they are also overburdened with work because there is high teacher-pupil ratio. The reason is simple. Majority of these countries who are not collecting enough to finance education correctly have ended up having poor numbers in terms of teacher-pupil ratio, even when they know that they need to employ the right numbers, because they cannot generate enough income to finance education. They have burdened the few teachers that are existing in those schools, thereby having unimaginable teacher-pupil ratio in a number of these poor countries. And that, obviously, we know that the ultimate impact is that the teaching or the provision of quality education automatically is compromised. The other aspect that is very critical as well, because of the failure by a number of these poor countries in financing education right, is that a number of our schools in most poor countries is that they have very poor infrastructure. And when you have poor infrastructure, there are a number of obvious outcomes in that environment. First of all, is that when there is poor infrastructure, because governments cannot finance education in the manner that they are supposed to finance it, automatically it spills over to having poor infrastructure. And where there is poor infrastructure, automatically you cannot guarantee the quality teaching. Poor infrastructure in terms of housing for teachers, poor infrastructure in terms of classroom space. In some schools, you have schools where there are no desks, and because schools cannot be financed right, even in terms of the basic teaching and learning materials that are supposed to be used by teachers, they are not even provided in certain poor countries where even education financing is very poor. And that has a direct impact in terms of the outcomes of our education systems in a number of these poor countries that we are talking about today, where education is not properly financed. The other aspect that I can quickly comment on is that because a number of countries who are not mobilizing and financing education right, the next thing that comes on is that you see that a number of these poor countries where even education financing is a struggle, they actually pay their teachers the lowest. There is low wages, low salaries for teachers, which ultimately spills over into a demotivated teaching force. You cannot guarantee quality when you are not paying the teachers right. I've seen that in a number of countries where even education financing is a huge problem. You can see that even in terms of the provision of salaries, the type of salaries that these teachers are paid, they are nothing that people can be able to talk about. And ultimately, I think this clearly spills over to the quality of work that the teachers ultimately begin to provide. And that on its own becomes a huge problem. Now, because of the short time, the 5 minutes, what is it that has happened due to the poor tax systems that a number of countries have inherited for a number of reasons? The first thing is that education systems in the countries where the tax systems have a lot of flaws is that they have poor quality of education that is provided in a number of those countries. Poor quality of education, which ultimately also has been as a result of poor conditions of service ultimately on the teachers who are supposed to provide the quality teaching and learning. And to us, as members of Education International and as experts in the education sector who are providing hands-on activities in the education system and who are directly impacted negatively on poor education financing, I think the quick comment that we can indicate is that as long as we do not change the narrative when it comes to fair tax systems for poor countries, we can as well forget about talking about quality provision of education for all children who have attained the age of going into the education system. Therefore, if we are to talk about quality provision of education, we must ensure that tax justice becomes top on the agenda of all countries. We must also put top on the agenda locally generated resources to support education so that our education systems in a number of poor countries who depend mostly on donor-funded education have failed to provide localized sustainable education that can trigger sustainable development for respective countries. Because ultimately, from the experience on the Zambian scenario, we have seen that one of the greatest impacts that teachers have subjected themselves to just begin to follow is that a number of education aid that comes to a number of African countries and poor countries have distorted the quality of education that is supposed to be provided by a number of our qualified teachers. And ultimately, if we are to guarantee quality, we must be able to provide fair tax systems and ensure that our teachers and our schools are financed right. And once that is done in the orderly manner, then we can guarantee quality teaching and learning. Otherwise, the direct impact in terms of poor education financing rests at the end of the day on the teachers who are the last recipients and who are expected to provide quality teaching under very difficult conditions, which are
I'm sorry,
generated because of
Kakunta,
poor
time is
financing.
over.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to you. I'm sorry about the interruption. So now I will give the floor to Maria for hearing the experience of the Task Alliance in Nepal. So over to you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you very much to all the speakers. I can see that this is a very passionate topic and everyone wants to speak, and these 5 minutes they seem to be different times for different people, which is fine. So please now let me introduce you to Renu, who will be presenting from the Tax Education Alliance in Nepal. So Renu, over to you.
Thanks, Maria. So are you seeing my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Namaste, everyone. This is Renu from Nepal, and I'm working as a project coordinator for the Education Out Loud projects. So I will quickly go through these slides because of the time constraints. We have the Tax Ed Alliance Nepal, and comprising of 3 major national alliances, that is ANSI Nepal, TAPSA, and the teachers unions. And beside this, we also have the local partners of ActionAid at the local level. And again, I am connecting the local level networks and groups to whom we have been engaging, especially in the field of advocacy and campaigning. They are the local education watch groups who will be more engaging to monitor the school governance activities for the quality education, as well as for this education financing agenda to be amplified at the ground level. We also have been working with the youth groups who are actually engaging in the tax justice and education campaigning, and we do have also the NC networks in different 40 districts of Nepal. Okay, so talking about the overall goals of this project, as you are already aware of this goals, that this project aims to create a strong civil society alliances to advocate for and bring about commitments to increase the domestic financing of public education system in a sustainable, just, and a progressive way, so that the lower income government can achieve SDG. And these projects also have a specific objectives, but I would like to skip this one. So we have been working in 3 major intervention areas through this Tax Aid Alliance. Number 1 is evidence generation through local and national research. We do have completed the local tax reform, domestic place, effects of global policies, budget tracking, and education financing gaps and SDG. These are the research we have carried over in Nepal, and some of the research are in a launching process, and some of the research have already been launched in Nepal. And beside this, we have also targeting some of the CSOs, education and the tax actors, government counterparts, and parliamentarian to provide the capacity building trainings and the workshop to aware and sensitize more on these issues and the link up between the education financing and tax justice. And then finally, we will be doing the evidence-based advocacy and campaigning based on the research findings we have in the ground. Okay, before going to share you about the key achievements that we have or we can see for almost 1 year, because in Nepal the implementation started in September 2021. So this is the background on best we have been advocating in these issues. And this year, the government has allocated only 10.98% of budgets in education sectors, which is one of the highest allocation in different sectors that have government planned for this year, though. But this percentage in a declining position since 2011, because in 2011 we have a 17% allocation in education sectors. And talking about the allocation in the education sectors, the budgets has been morely invested for the teacher's salary and benefit, that is around 80%, whereas the targets for this year from the education budget is to more about school building constructions. So you can see how the quality education can be ensured by these budget allocations. And another important alarming or alerting concern is that at the local level, the local government is depending more on the conditional grant that was allocated from the federal government. So as per our budget tracking research carried out in 2 palikas, it shows that the local government has been allocating budgets in the education sector less than 3% from their internal sources, whereas the federal government has been allocating around 61.4% to the local government, especially for investing in the teachers' capacity building and teachers' salaries and benefits and some of the infrastructures work at the local level. Okay, so the main slides that I want to highlight in this webinar is how the Nepal has been working and pushing this education, financing, and tax agenda and how the policymakers has been influenced from our different discourses and dialogue were as follows. I would say this is not as an outcome, but this is as an output level of impacts that we did in this 1 year. So basically, we were able to increase the accountability and ownership of parliamentarian and the political leaders, because in different dialogues and the capacity building workshops, the parliamentarian, especially the member of finance committee, realized that they have been missing to include the CSOs, especially in the pre-budgeting planning process, which is crucial to advocate to increase the budget for the educations. So that realization has also give a positive vibes for us like CSOs, that we can further have to work more to advocate during the pre-budgeting planning process. And during the workshop, some of the national planning members also realized that, and they are also missing the representation of CSOs during the pre-budget planning process. So that is very crucial. So as in Nepal, the planning budget process started in November, December. So this is the right time that we can push the agenda more during that process. And another important achievement we can see is that increased awareness and knowledge of the CSOs on debt financing and taxation, leading to the amplifying of the discourses at federal, province, and local level. For example, because of the training that we provided to the CSOs, now the local government has started inviting the CSOs, especially in the budget preparation process. And similarly, CSOs network also have, demanded to increase the budget for the education, especially after getting the trainings from this EOL project. So we focused that the demand has to, or will, because recently we have completed our local level election, and in November we have the federal and the province level government election. So we will be pushing the same agenda in November as well. And another important achievement we find after this work is parliamentarians have now acknowledged the need of CSOs regarding a budget preparation process at the parliamentarian work. And as you know that during the research that we have carried out in different local level, we also have realized that the policies and the tax systems are not very much progressive. Recently, we did one research at the local government level. Then there we find that all the policies and the act were like carry forward of like federal government. They have been applying the same policies and the act to in local level. So there is areas to work with the local government so that we can push the agenda of reforming of these tax systems. And another important issues that we find that during the planning process also there is a gap, that there is a minimal percentage of the community who are from the marginalized and who are associated with the school and education were not invited in the planning process, because of which we were not able to advocate and push this agenda of education financing. So these are some of the achievements that we can see during this 1 year of implementing these projects. And these are some of the evidence that we want to share that how the policymakers has made commitments after advocating these issues in different workshops and different policy level dialogues. These are some of the parliamentarian, some are the ministers, some are the province level chairpersons. So these are the people who like realize that this is really great, that how the tax system or the progressive taxation will like contribute to increase the education financing. And these are the work that we pushed to get that achievement. So we did like knowledge generation through policy brief. We published 3 policy briefs based on the research and the different fact sheets we have already in place. And we also developed some of the IEC materials, information, education, communication materials to aware of people in a simple way so that they can aware about the tax system, progressive taxation, and why the progressive taxation is important to increase and to contribute for the education financings. So direct or indirectly, we have reached a larger population through this knowledge generations. And another is we have done 4 kind of researches. Education financing gaps and SDG, local tax reform, budget tracking, and domestic place. And we also have done capacity building, especially I have already mentioned that we have a capacity building workshop for the parliamentarian. We have a training to the youth and the education watch groups, especially focusing on the tax justice and education financing. And we also have a different kind of local and the national level advocacy platform where we push the agenda of progressive tax. So these are some of the numerical data that we were able to reach the people through the capacity building workshops, and these are the outreach direct and the indirect population that were reached out through the policy advocacy from different dialogue, discourses, and demonstration and campaigning on increasing the education financing through progressive taxations, and research findings and policy sharing workshop, which also like somehow contribute for the policy advocacy. And finally, we have some kind of work which will be a continuation for the days. So we still have some research which needs to be launched. So we will be working on that. We still have a kind of dialogue and discourses on progressive tax and education financing. So that will also be continuing. And we also have a cross-sectoral capacity building with the parliamentarian, which will be planned for this November, immediately after the national level elections. And we will also have the lobbying with the Asian ministries in coordination with different regional level partners or the networks. So finally, I want to share a key learnings. Sorry, Maria, key learning. So as I already mentioned that we will be more focusing on the local level, because local level is also very crucial part that we need to contribute and engage with them, especially to reform the local tax systems and the policies. So this is very crucial, and at the same time the media partnership is very important to amplify our issues. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Renu, and thank you very much to our team of the Tax and Education Alliance in Nepal, who are doing really great job, a really, really great work. So thank you very much. And without much further ado, I would like to introduce you to Musa from Senegal. So Musa, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening. My name is Musa. I work with ActionAid Senegal as Governance and Advocacy Project Officer. I'm coordinating the Education Out Loud project. So as the previous presentation has really showed so far the importance of making the link between the education and the tax, I think it's so far the time for us to really make in practice what has been coming out based on all this presentation. And if we are talking about basically from Senegal, if we are talking about education and we're trying to handle the different difficulties or problems that are happening, we're talking about the adapted infrastructure, we're talking about the problem of lack of teacher, we're talking about the problem of the quality of education, but also so far the management resources And if we have a look on that, all these difficulties, all these problems are coming around. I have one common element, which is the resources, the problem of the resources, the funding of the education. And I think the different research we have done so far, the fact sheet we have developed during this project, this Education Out Loud project, has shown that we really have a lot to capture on tax, and also to take just one part and reverse it or to finance it for the education sector. And I'm going just to share one document with just some slides, at least to show what type of effort did we do during, like, according to this Education Out Loud project in Senegal. What are the key recommendations that really come from the civil society organization, the community, and the different stakeholders, and what also are the different challenges we have faced, and in terms of perspective, what are we willing to do? So I'm going to just share my screen, and you will let me know if you see it.
I can't see it yet, but maybe you can start. Oh, yeah, something is happening. Please keep it short, Musa, because we are doing really badly in terms of time. Thank you.
Yes.
We can see it now.
Yes. Now, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Exactly. I'm going to try to keep it short, as Maria said it. Then this is just a short update of the Education Out Loud project in Senegal. As part of this project, is talking about these three elements: the governance, the education, and tax. We are working with three different partners: the Forum Civil, which is the tax civil society organization, the COSIDE, which is the education coalition, and also the USEC, which is the teachers union education. And as part of the key achievement, if we are talking about the improvement of the access to decision-making spaces, we have been creating 28 tax committees, have been setting up at local, and in the 45 departments in Senegal. We have also 10 women community champions on gender-responsive public service and local budget planning for quality of education. And also 117 school management committees has been trained also on budget monitoring. And as a result of that, one woman champion has been selected as a counselor in charge of education and the women's right. So in terms of capacity building and the awareness raising also, we have been able to 447 civil society organization and community representative. They was trained on education financing and tax and accountability. And 97 government representative was also trained on education financing and tax and accountability, as well as the capacity building of 7 local organizations, also including 4 teachers union was trained on public accountability and budget monitoring. So the last element about the key achievement, which is the advocacy and the policy work, we have been able to mobilize more than 12 national and local organizations around the education, finance, and tax. In 2021, thanks to the advocacy work, the teachers union have conducted the government and have recruited 5,000 more teachers dispatched in different regions. And in terms of advocacy on education financing also, it was led by the teachers union and the civil society organization. It enabled the government to increase teachers' salary from 40 to 50%. I think these are some of the key achievements around advocacy and the policy work. Maybe after I will share this document so that we have broader information about that. And what are the main challenges? I think it's always good to know about the challenges we are facing in order to integrate it in our future intervention. We had the limited resources, but we had also the time constraint, the COVID-19, which has really impacted the whole ongoing system. The election period, because in Senegal, when we have the election period, we can say that everything is going slowly and it's somehow difficult to mobilize different stakeholders and decision makers. The limited knowledge on tax and fiscality issues also, most particularly for civil society organizations. Most of them who are intervening on that domain have limited knowledge about what is tax related really and how can we capture enough resources to finance the education. And the resistance from government representative, the fear of change, we know it as the money is the nerve of the world. So now I'm going to talk about the learnings before the recommendation. Some of the learning we have captured so far for during this project is that the access to financial information and budget development process are the key to hold the government accountable. The other learning is also the fact that the developing partnership can make a difference instead of just acting as a opposition. They are also in need. So bringing also in gender perspective can make the difference in building a system that captures real needs of the community. Always in the learning, We have also the fact that through the practical tools, the reflection action toolkit we have developed during this project, for example, is a very suitable way to facilitate the understanding of the local communities, particularly in terms of budget monitoring. We cannot always take the academic knowledge coming doing PowerPoints or documents to train them how to make budget follow-up. I think developing this type of toolkit is really relevant for them to facilitate their understanding. We have also the use of the practice of artistic activism is also a very innovative way to capture more audiences and to get our message across the project. If taxation, we have this initiative around accelerated youth engagement work, which is the artistic activism, which can really show a lot and capture a lot of audience that really would be difficult to catch initially. And the last point about the learning is also the potential of the youth engagement, which is important to bring the change and also to build this type of relief, this type of next generation, which will be aware of all these different issues. And now I'm going to talk about some publication we have done. Like we have done the fact sheet and some research we published at the community level and also at national level, and we launched it officially through the call with the team of the Education Out Loud project. And if we come about the recommendations, one of the recommendations is ensure the effectiveness of the Ministry of National Education Program performance framework in achieving the results set out in the program budget. There is also another recommendation which is talking about the hold of schools management committees accountable for the use of allocated resources. We also talking about the support of territorial authorities in the resource mobilization strategy by involving the local tax commission. Because I have been creating what we call the local tax commission and the local commission for justice, for tax justice, to make the follow-up in everything which is done. We have also to mitigate tax losses through streamlining and tax expenditures, limited and also balanced tax treaties. We have also as a recommendation to redirect part of the actual mining funds toward investment in the national education sector. In Senegal, we have a lot of yes, I don't know if the time is, but I'm just finishing. Yes, and the last element about the recommendation is also the setup and integrated efficient financial information system that allow the visibility and the eligibility of all the financing in the sector. Now, just talk about the communication, how we are intended to do the communication around all this work, the work we are doing by doing Twitter rallies to enhance the conversation between targeted audiences and also to share the key findings, how is it during the advocacy activities. We have also the sharing on Facebook and Instagram of infographic productions of some talkative data that we have collected during the evidence collection researches. We do also the radio broadcast to engage some communities that cannot access the social media content, but also do the public learning sessions, which with the youth platform to the activism. So these are the key messages that we are using in our work around making the link between tax and education. The first one is education financing as a priority. The second one is don't close your eyes. Fair tax is human right. Progressive taxation for more domestic resources. Let's engage. So this is what I wanted to share with you in terms of action we have done, in terms of recommendation, but also the main challenges we have been facing during our work in this Education Out Loud project. Just finishing by saying that this work around the financial education is not an individual, but it's also collective work. It's always good to collect a lot of funds at local level, but also to see how can we engage more broader with all these initiatives at national and global level to really build a strong awareness for our stakeholders, decisions makers, and also for all these technical and financial partners that are turning around or working around the education. So maybe if there's questions, I can come back, or also I will share this document. So it was a pleasure for me to share this information with you. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Musa. Really appreciate it. Amazing work again that you are doing in Senegal. So really appreciate it. Now I would like to encourage everyone who has questions to start using the Q&A section before we go to the last speaker, who is Uchisi from Zambia, who will be sharing the work that they are doing as part of the Tax Ed Alliance in Zambia. So thank you very much, Musa, again. Uchisi, over to you. Uchisi, we can see your presentation, but I can't hear your voice yet.
Afternoon, Maria. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening. From Zambia, I think similar to Nepal and Senegal, we have been implementing this this project here in Zambia, the Tax Aid Alliance, and I'll just skip straight through to the project implementation and the partners we've been working with. So I think as some of them are already part of the core, here in Zambia, we've been working particularly with the Education Coalition at ZANIC, and then also CTPD for our technical work, and also with the teachers unions, and more recently with NAKES, which also has an alliance focusing on the girl child here in Zambia, and also sponsored by Education Out Loud. So it's been interesting working with them on SDG 4, and also looking at how we can collectively work together to improve education systems here in Zambia, and also financing on the fiscal side of things. So I think in terms of project implementation, just recently, last week, we're excited to finally launch the two pieces of research that we had been working on this year. One done by ZANIC and the other one done by CTPD. And both of these, we hope that they can be used going forward in terms of project implementation, in terms of capacity building, in terms of lobbying with government ministries and other government agencies such as the Revenue Authority, and also with parliamentarians moving forward. But it was exciting to finally disseminate the findings of these research studies. We had the participation of many government officials from the Ministry of Education and also from the Ministry of Finance, who were quite receptive to the findings and look forward to using them in their work as well in terms of policy formulation. Previously in the year, we had also had courtesy calls to these government ministries, which also went well and have allowed us to continue working with them closely as we implement the projects both at national level and also in the communities. Recently, following our midterm review of the project, which happened earlier this year in July, we did have the opportunity to go back to the communities that we were working with, and spoke to the parent-teacher committees and the government officials, and also some of the learners in the two districts we're working with in Chipata and Choma. And as you can see in the pictures, you can see that the classrooms are quite packed. And this was one of the problems we did identify following the introduction of the free education policy here in Zambia, that has seen a huge influx of learners around the country. I think similar to what Musa had already highlighted, we did have fact sheets also in Zambia that we have used for various advocacy activities, and have been very helpful in breaking down the messages on and creating linkages between education financing and also domestic resource mobilization through taxes. And as I mentioned, the collaborations have been quite helpful through the various partners we have at national level, but even at regional level, we have been working quite closely with Tax Justice Network Africa, particularly on tax issues, and looking at Zambia, at how we're quite dependent on the extractive sector. The Tax Justice Network Africa have been helpful in breaking down and creating that linkage between the extractives and tax collection, and from that we can also link that to education financing for this project. So it's been very interesting working with those regional partners, and we look forward to learning from them and their best practices across the region and across the continent of Africa. Broadly speaking, not looking at the outputs of our activities per se, but just major milestones in education in Zambia. I think from the ushering in of the new government last year, we have seen a new budget for 2022 that was quite expansionary in nature, and it also saw the significant increase in the size of the Constituency Development Fund, which has a component of education in there. And the size has been very welcomed in communities in terms of what they can do and the projects they can implement at that level. Following that, we've had the successful recruitment of teachers here in Zambia. About 30,400 teachers were recruited. And this was in line with the national budget, but it was good to see that they actually implemented on their promises. And there have been question marks, obviously, on the sustainability of some of these budget pronouncements. And coming in of the IMF has obviously come with its own conditions that we're not too sure about. But later today, actually, we'll be hearing from the IMF, who will be issuing a statement in terms of the progress made with the Zambian government, and hopefully, there's hope that they would announce whatever deal has been reached between the two cooperating partners. And additionally, I think, as Mr. Kakunta mentioned, teacher salaries were increased at the start of the year, but these are still not competitive and are still not adequate for many of the teachers around the country. So in terms of challenges that we've faced at national level and also regional level, the first has been the lack of transparency in policy formulation, and also in how the government is going about domestic resource mobilization, for instance, and how they are drawing their negotiations basically with the IMF. So this has been a huge challenge for us in terms of knowing the policy direction, and also just accessing information on taxation and on education financing from the various government institutions. And which also leads to the second point of limited and inconsistent data. So when we do find information, it's usually delayed or it's not consistent over a sustained period of time, which makes it very hard for us to analyze and draw recommendations and conclusions from that. And then at national level, looking at our partners and our non-state actors that we've been working with, we've noted that there's been a limited understanding between, in terms of linking taxation and also education financing. This has been noted at both national level and also community level here in Zambia. So we do try to break down the messages and try to make them a bit more relatable in terms of what people are actually going through at community level. And then there's been a new agenda here in Zambia that has basically trying to put the private sector in the forefront of development, which I guess in looking at it holistically might be a good approach, looking at the tight fiscal space of the government at the moment. But it has come with various tax incentives and tax holidays that basically would deprive the Treasury of much needed resources for development, especially as we speak about the target to have our tax to GDP ratio increase by over 5% of GDP over the next 2 to 3 years. And then at a regional level, again, there's limited knowledge of international policies, standards, and developments at international level. And this comes again back to our non-state actors at national and community level. As CSOs here in Zambia, I think there's very limited knowledge in terms of tax practices at international level. For instance, how the OECD influences tax and tax policies here in Zambia, who are actually signatories of the OECD. Looking at lessons at community level, obviously there's still need for continuous capacity building to link the 4 R's of taxation and also the 4 S's of education financing here in Zambia. So we look to have more capacity building done at community level, but also at national level with the help of our national partners. And following our research launch, we hope to have these capacity building activities done as soon as possible, especially before the national budget announcements in October. And then there's also a need for systematic engagement on issues of public and social accountability to enhance the confidence at community level in government processes, and also to hold the government accountable even beyond the scope of this project. And then some more lessons at national level. There's need for continuous engagement with our national and regional partners. Obviously, we have been working together, but it's nice to also have the alliance from NAKEZ come on board, and we look to continuously involve them in our activities and implementation moving forward. And I feel like this would allow us to achieve our outcomes for this project, and hopefully see where else we can go beyond this project. And then I think, as David Archer mentioned in his introductory remarks, there's a need for a mindset change here in Zambia. Just at our launch event last week, there was a big debate about whether education is a consumption or whether it's an investment. And I think the Ministry of Education tried to put their foot down on the fact that education is in fact an investment in the future, investment in our human development. And I think that's something we would need to change, not only at a community level, but particularly at a policy level in terms of taxation at that level of government. And then there have also been lessons around access to information, and we hope to utilize the current review of the Access to Information Bill here in Zambia to enhance transparency, accountability for non-state actors to also participate in national matters. And then also support through research we've learned that it assists the ministries quite a lot. And our reference, for instance, the ActionAid Sweet Nothings study on double taxation agreements is still something that is used by the Ministry of Finance in terms of negotiating double taxation agreements. And we hope to continue to support through the various pieces of research. In our WhatsApp group, as a Tax Aid Alliance here in Zambia, we were just discussing how we might need to do a bit more research in terms of how much we're losing in revenue from the various industries we have here in Zambia, and how that could be channeled, and also complement the study that we did with ZANEC earlier this year. And then at a regional level, working with TGNA, we've seen that there's been a strengthened network for tax justice between tax justice and education actors. And then there's also been peer-to-peer learning from lessons from one country to another. So I think for Zambia, that's about it. Maria, I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Uchisi, and very sorry again for going over time. I cannot see any questions. I don't know if there are any burning questions. Please put your hand up and we will try to see you in case there is any burning questions. I guess, Luis, do we have still interpretation?
Yes, for a couple of minutes more.
Okay, so perhaps it is time. Yeah, so perhaps it is time for Julie to make some concluding remarks whilst we still have the interpretation. Julie, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria and Luis, for the moderation, great moderation. It seems we never have enough time. We've had 2 hours, but we still had to rush through all the presentations. So I will only take 2 minutes to make the concluding remarks. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for the brilliant presentations, which have been made from the global, regional, and country level. These have highlighted the importance of tax justice for education financing. We have ably answered the question, why link education and tax justice? We've had concrete examples from the regions that have presented. We've had concrete examples from the work that the 3 countries, Nepal, Zambia, and Senegal, are doing through the Tax Aid Alliance project under the Education Out Loud. And we have been able to link these issues globally to see how they are all linked globally. So in conclusion, what I can say is that there has been a chronic underfunding of education, which is having an impact on the achievement of SDG 4. The poor financing has had direct impact on teachers who are an important resource to the provision of quality education are in short supply and are also working in poor conditions due to this underfunding of education. So as CSOs, what is our role in all this? So we need to ensure that we are holding our respective governments and the global community to account on commitments they have made on financing of education. So we have heard from the presentations that have been made today that generating evidence for our advocacy is very important. We have heard from the regions on the type of evidence they have been able to generate. We have heard globally the type of evidence that has been generated. And in addition to that, we also have the GEM report. We've also heard from the countries, from the studies that they have been able to conduct to generate evidence which is being used for advocacy. So I would like to encourage everyone to look at these resources that have been shared. I think the links have been shared. I've seen some of the links. I know there's been a problem to share this in the chat with everybody, but I hope a solution has been found and that all the participants have been able to see these links. So we need to ensure that we monitor the expenditure in our countries and also publicize this for wider advocacy. We also need to engage with other CSOs working in other public sectors. We've talked about the 4S framework. In particular, when we are looking at the size of the overall budget through progressive tax reforms, we need to engage in others, because if the overall size of the budget increases, the share to education and other sectors increases too. So let's make an effort to engage with CSOs working in other sectors in our work in ensuring tax justice for financing of public services. Capacity building is another area that has been emphasized, that we need to ensure that we are building the capacity of the CSOs, including the youth, government stakeholders, as well as members of parliament. The media has been highlighted as an important key stakeholder in raising awareness on the importance of progressive taxation for education financing. So let's engage with the media. So as the TaxAid Alliance, we will continue with this great work and ensure that we do see the change happening at country level. As already mentioned, that 97% of education financing comes from domestic resources. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done at country level so that we are able to measure the change that has taken place at country level on financing for education. And finally, let me thank you all very much, and GCE in particular for the collaboration in organizing this webinar. Maria, for the great work you have done in the collaboration in organizing this webinar. And thanks again to all our speakers, the participants and the interpreters, and sorry for keeping you beyond the time that you were supposed to have been with us in this webinar. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. Thanks, Maria. You want to say something to just close the session? Wonderful to have many people in the session. We definitely have to organize something in the near future to have more time to discuss, but it's so inspiring to see the presentations, how people are really engaged about linking together, bringing together taxation and education. Thank Maria and Julie for bringing us to all these very important debates. And over to you, Maria, to say goodbye or whatever you want.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Luis Eduardo. Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much for everyone who has been here, listening to us patiently, dealing with us. And I hope that this is only a taste of some of the stuff that we are doing. And it has shown, as Julie was saying, the need to really link tax justice and education, particularly for financing for education, but for everything else and other public services as well. So I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Salma, Phila, and
Bye-bye.
Eve,
Thank you.
interpreters.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.